The Holocaust Sacrifice. Sometime later, God tasted Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." We must look on this as a privilege, a great rapprochement with the Creator, a difficult trial that the patriarch has come through, proving in this way to his Creator his blind faith, as if, by obeying the divine order to leave, Lech Lecha, his native land, he had come closer to Canaan, while by obeying the second divine order to leave, Lech Lecha, for the mountain of Moriah, he had sanctified himself its approach, on the very place that would later serve as the location for the Temple of Jerusalem. That is why this act earned him the name of God's minister. As a burnt offering, as a holocaust, is said in Hebrew as a olah, the offering, a word that counterbalances a elah, the oath that Abraham has sworn by doing this. The Aolah, or holocaust, goes up towards heaven. Go up is expressed in Hebrew as olah, while the Elah, the oath, is a contract with God that comes down to men. It seems that all the sufferings that the Jewish people have experienced in the past, and those that they will suffer in the future, will be compensated for by the grace that will be their lot at the end of time. What oath are we talking about here? That by which the patriarch had committed himself to sacrifice his son Isaac, whose conception he had just learned of, in exchange for the resurrection of the souls of the people of Lot, that the Lord had destroyed along with the towns of Sodom, Gomorrah, Zvoim, Adela, and Belach. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Early suggests that he hadn't slept all night, and that morning was a fitting time for sacrifice and prayer. One compensates for the other. Morning is boker. The root of which is bakar, which means animals, mammals, and implies that this morning was propitious for animal sacrifices. Saddle this donkey is put to indicate that despite an individual standing, he is still a material entity, and he needs to rise above his earthly form in order to attain to the level of spirituality that an act as out of the ordinary as the sacrifice of his son carries with it. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. Why did Abraham take with him Eliezer and Ishmael, as the oral tradition of the Midrash tells us? It may be that they represented Abraham's 2 basic drives: the drive to do good, that counsels Abraham to do everything that God asks of him, as a true servant of God. For this is what the name Eliezer means: God comes to help me. But on the other hand, there is also the drive to do wrong, that whispers in his ear the while, "Do not respect this sentence of death, and this divine command. It's an illegitimate order, like the order that you formerly argued against, to destroy the just and the unjust indiscriminately. Ishmael, of whom it is said, he will be like a wild donkey of a man, Genesis 16:12, Pere. For the divinity, Elokut, represented by the letter Aleph at the end of the word, is revelatory of his attitude with regard to divine precepts. It may well be that on that day, the day of Isaac's sacrifice, the attribute of justice was weighing heavily on the patriarch, and he desired an equitable judgment. For this reason, he had with him that day a prosecutor and a defender. Ishmael would serve as an accuser. It was easy for him, as he did not like his brother Isaac, and Eliezer would be counsel for the defense. For the whole of the journey, the two acolytes did not utter a word, and their heavenly ministers pleaded for them for and against. Higher worlds were all ears and waiting for what was going to happen, namely that a human, unconditionally subject by his intelligence and understanding to God's orders to the point of being willing to comply with an illegitimate command, was going to proceed to make a human sacrifice. And what is more, a father was going to sacrifice his son. This was unprecedented. The trial lasted for 3 long days, as Abraham hoped that he would be spared the carrying out of his vow, sacrificing Isaac, to offset the resurrection of the souls of the people of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. He counted on God's graciousness. When he had cut enough wood, he set out. In order to have his son, he had Flora, the root, bear witness for him. It is recorded of the temple in Jerusalem that 3 times your descendants will see the face of God without empty-handedness. Trees are perfect for sacrifices and gifts to show gratitude. But human beings are not. Human existence and respect for human life has always been a fundamental principle in the Hebrew worldview. That is why Abraham calls on plant life to plead in his favor to the Almighty. When he stoops with puffy eyes to cut woods, he hopes that the latter will plead in his favor and exclaim, "There will be no more human sacrifices." He set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Genesis 22, verses 3 and 4. In the distance comes out in Hebrew as merachok, and can be read in the same way as marchok, which means the bitterness of the sentence. That is, how bitter is the reality of the judgment weighing down on him. The same anxiety and bitterness weigh down on the infant Moses when his mother delivers him up to the hazards of the water of the Nile. There, the child is followed by the eyes of his sister Miriam. It is said, his sister stood at a distance, merachok, to see what would happen to him. She too knows that the child's fate was bitter, and that divine judgment was deliberating on the bitterness of his destiny. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife, and the two of them went on together. Fire is the spirituality and the aptitude for grasping divinity that burns inside us. It is the wisdom without which man cannot reach the high spheres of spirituality that allow him to understand the secrets of creation. The knife is the din, or justice, which puts an end to life and which swallows the fate of its victim. The word for this in Hebrew is ma'achelet. The root of the words ochel means food, and kale means to destroy, as it is recorded on Mount Sinai of the golden calf. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Leave this place. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way." In the stomach, whose basic attribute is yesod, is located the digestive process that gives off heat from burning calories and swallows food. Here may be found the wisdom of fire in its basic attribute, the understanding according to which we are made in the image of animals, and that the fire of bestiality burns in us, the subject of the sacrifice on this occasion. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son." Abraham replied, "The fire and the wood are they here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" We will never know what the animal thinks that we are going to sacrifice, but Isaac's thoughts are along these lines. Here is the fire, human wisdom, the vitality of the thought that burns in us, and the wood is human intellect, for like the latter, it stirs up wisdom and incites it to reflect a wood, as wood stirs up fire and feeds it. Flame is knowledge, the synthesis of both, the light engendered by all thought processes, and it becomes a fresh reality like childbirth. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Where is the divine wisdom, the grace, which recommends us not to sacrifice human beings, and which whispers to us that such a sacrifice is not pleasing to God? Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. The latter's response is that the supreme judge will determine the fate of each individual. He will see the sins of each of us and decide who will be the lamb and who will be the butcher. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided, and it is not the butcher, and it is not the mountain of the Lord, Mount Sinai, where God himself said, "I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." Exodus chapter 33, verse 19. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. After having asked the flora to plead in his favor, Abraham asks an inanimate object to plead his case as well. He addresses the altar, made of stones, appealing to his intelligence, the intelligence that acted as a precursor to its creation. For we say in Hebrew, Vaiben, which means and he built. Binah means intelligence. And says to it, the children of Israel will come to make offerings and sacrifices, to take part in the building of the temple in this very spot, from cedars of Lebanon and stones that will serve to build its wall. They will alternate their use of these materials, row on row, and that the inanimate and flora will together be involved in its construction. They will be present with the children of Israel, bring their offerings, and when the Kohanim sacrifice live animals to honor the Almighty. How can they be present at a human sacrifice without pleading the cause of humanity? Author's own commentary. The word for Holocaust in Hebrew is mizbeach. It is מזכה בזכויות בריאת החי וחסכונותיו, which means to grant rights acquired to creation and their defects by living beings. It permits the resurrection of the souls whose body has been burnt for the sanctification of God, al-Kiddush Hashem, and to make reparation for living beings and their faults. And the fire on the altar will consume it. This is the link between the past, with the sacrifice of Isaac, and the future, with the reparation of Jacob's flock, streaked, colored, spotted, as well as the holy work of the sacrifices that will once again be sacrificed in the temple. Effectively, the world will consume comes out in Hebrew as tukad, and the word for sacrifice is akedah, tokad, and this is a reverence, kidah, for God, the recognition of His royalty, akidah. Here are the sacrifices in their order of magnitude: sacrifices of Olah, sacrifices of Chatat, with their root in Avla of crimes, word Chet mean sins, sacrifices of Asham from the word for guilt, in Hebrew Ashma, sacrifices of Milwim and sacrifices of holocausts and Shlamim. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. The hand is heavy and unwilling to carry out an illegitimate order, to take the life of an innocent, in order to honor the vow made by Abraham, who promised to sacrifice his son to God if the latter would consecrate to him the souls of the people of Lot, akin to his own, in Sodom and Gomorrah, in their future life. Each gesture is heavily underlined, as if to describe the eternity that separates one from the other. But the moment comes when commitments have to be honored. He insists on the perfection of the mitzvah in carrying out this operation in order to make a success of the sacrifice, and for it to be beneficial to the resurrection of the tormented souls of Sodom and Gomorrah. He remembers the Midrash when we read with regard to Cain. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. Abraham carried out this divine order reluctantly, as repentant people carry out mitzvot without conviction. The force that guides them is the same, It's divine providence that benevolently takes into account the good deeds of their forebears and their descendants. Cain perhaps noticed that God kept his distance from his offering, not because the fruits of the earth are less appetizing than the firstborn of a flock, but perhaps because there are souls buried in what comes from the ground that have sinned more than others in their previous life and still need to serve their time for a long time to come before being authorized to transport themselves to the body of an animal in order to be sacrificed as a preliminary to assuming human form. Cain perhaps noticed that God kept his distance from his offering, not because the fruits of the earth are less appetizing than the firstborn of a flock, but perhaps because there are souls buried in what comes from the ground that have sinned more than others in their previous life, and we still need to serve their time for a long time to come before being authorized to transport themselves to the body of an animal in order to be sacrificed as a preliminary to assuming human form. The animal sacrifice of Abel, however, allowed souls already purified by their long retention in stone and flora to go on to be human, thanks to their consecration and by means of their sacrifice in conformity with the divine order of things. All the more so, as Abel had proceeded to the sanctification of the animal for reasons that proved his lively understanding of ancestral traditions and customs, since he had in mind the future vision of the consecration to God of the firstborn of Egypt, in memory of whom we celebrate 4,000 years after the event, the Pidyon, the redemption of the firstborn. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son, from heaven." God's heavenly emissary has not had time to complete his mission, and it has therefore been necessary to intervene from heaven at the last minute so as to avert a tragedy. Or else, after 3 days of terrifying dilemmas and internal consecration, Abraham, for a mere man of flesh and blood, finds himself in an elevated state, in a second heaven, where instincts reign supreme, the world of instincts in which the judgment of Isaac takes place. The whole of the universe and all the higher worlds are on the tenterhooks to see what is going to happen. The phrase, "Ye have not withheld your son," translates into Hebrew as "lo chasachta," the root of the word choshech, which means darkness, as the letters S and SH are interchangeable. In Hebrew it's shin and sin. For this act signals the supremacy of the forces of light and intellect over those of darkness and obscurantism. In the same way, the word for son, actually young child, which is nar in Hebrew, is a manifest allusion to the masculinity of the souls of the children of Israel, which carries on from one generation to the next, and which is indeed that combats the forces of evil and darkness, evoking the memory of human history and the purpose of divine creation within the framework of educating adolescents. If we transpose the letters shin and sin, we obtain lo shachachta, you have not forgotten. This reminds us of the past and of the pact established between man and his Creator. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by his horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. God's grace is limitless, for it originates from the twin attributes of paternity and maternity. God, at this crucial moment, sends as a sign of grace and pardon a ram to sacrifice in the place of Isaac. The speech for the defense has had its effect. The divine order has prevailed despite Abraham's vow to sacrifice his son in order to save the tormented souls of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he has re-established in the supremacy of his royalty the rule according to which life is an essential element of creation, human sacrifice being wholly unacceptable. There is no truth in the adage, the end justifies the means. Respect for life supersedes this. This may appear benign to us today, but at the time, it was a revolutionary idea, for all civilizations practiced human sacrifice. It was central to their way of life. What right does God have to render null and void a human promise? The same right that a father has when he overwrites the vow or the promise of his daughter, the right of divine paternity. Abraham, therefore, is, in this sense, the first ideological revolutionary of all time. Only animal sacrifice is authorized, and no believer respectful of divine loyalty is authorized to take the life of his neighbor. This belief renders derisory and marginal jihadi murderers in the world who practice a contrary, rebellious belief in this respect. Human sacrifice is forbidden, even if man comes under the heading of homo loquens and is, in this capacity, subject in general to the law of the survival of the fittest. Human discourse is an instrument of prayer and communication with God, and in his sublime wisdom, God would not be without it. Besides, this is the main argument of Isaac's defense speech, the argument according to which a human sacrifice would have deprived God of the prayer of a human being. So as to remove all doubt from this matter, we read further on this of Isaac. He went out to the field one evening to meditate. The Hebrew word for meditate is lasuach, from the root of the word siach, meaning bush or thicket. First and foremost, to annul human sacrifice and replace it with the sacrifice of flora and fauna. And secondly, so as to remember Abraham's ram caught in a thicket, zvach, siach becha, which means the word is in you, with sin instead of samech, symbolizing the divine interventionism that lavishes on those who satisfy his will the grace and abundance they have need of. It is from here that the idea came according to which sacrifice compensates for and cancels the sins of humans. He sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. The word instead of come out as tachat, implying resurrection. Tchiyat metim, resurrection of the dead. For the resurrection of the dead will compensate for the shortness of Isaac's life, is sacrifice and the fact that since our first parents sinned, eternity on earth has been denied them. Abraham's action brought about the pardon of the sins of the first men on earth, and granted to his descendants the right to be resurrected. It was the purpose of his youth, the most intelligent of innovations, in an idolatrous society based on slavery. It was his noblest action, the action that won for him the name of God's minister. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Because is ya'an and includes the root of the word inui, that means suffering and torture. Inui. Because God tested Abraham, and that test was perceived by Abraham as out of the ordinary psychological suffering, arising from the question of whether he should sacrifice his son or not. And I do not think he doubted for a moment that his destiny consisted in the possibility of converting the souls of Sodom and Gomorrah, since that was the bottom line. God blessed him accordingly. It is to God that he answered Na'ana, from the same root as Ana, which in Hebrew means to answer blindly. And because you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand of the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of your enemies. This is reminiscent of the image of a cloud of locusts, too innumerable to count. Where's the blessing in this? Didn't God also bless Noah in this way? Perhaps not, for Noah's blessing has a quantitative connotation of planet-wide dispersal, while that of Abraham has a qualitative connotation in that it preaches the theological expansion of the monotheistic version of divinity. I would maintain in Kabbalistic terms that Noah's blessing is on the level of a basic attribute, Yesod, the sphere of the stomach, while that of Abraham is to be found higher up, at the level of intelligence and human wisdom, Chokhmah. The underlying message is this: because you did not abandon the soul of your son to the forces of evil and darkness, and in exchange for those, you asked for the souls of thousands of people to be saved, those of the inhabitants of the towns of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zvoya, and Bela. I will strengthen the souls of your descendants with the potential of their spiritual resources, and they will be propagated, scattered, and shared in your offspring throughout the world and all future generations. I will multiply your prosperity. Zarecha et arbe. Zaracha means seed, zera, and if we substitute the letter zayin for the letter gimel, for they are historically interchangeable, identical, and symmetrical with each other, the Z sound being open to the left and the G sound being open to the right. For example, Ger means zar, ger means zar, foreigner or stranger. We get the word for grain, seed growing in the ground, gera, being the root of the word gerin, which means kernel. This teaches us that human seed contains the power of multiplication, as well as human qualities such as wisdom, intelligence, and knowledge present in the seed that will flower and bear fruit in the future. We are talking here about a mold that the divine will has forged in a human being, as well as in flora and fauna, and also and indubitably in inanimate material at the beginning of time. Abraham's blessing is therefore nothing other than a preliminary genetic conditioning for all future generations, the gene of divine comprehension, and an aptitude for geometrical progression in three-dimensional space, owing to an immaterial and invisible creative force, nistar, commonly called God, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the shore. Like the sand, he said in Hebrew kachol, to remind us that divine grace has granted us that precious gift of a kachol, a sea nail, the blue ink from which served for the manufacture of talit, the prayer shawls. It is not just the expression of plurality that counts here, but that of sanctity and spirituality implied by priestly use. This same gene of divine intelligence, as I call it, is indeed Abraham's legacy to all future generations. Like the superimposed layers of an onion, succeeding generations contain all the adventures of previous generations, which have been imprinted on their hearts and will not be effaced. It is the atavistic memory, zikaron, which is perpetrated in newborn males, zachar. It's a people traumatized by remembering its history deep down in its soul. This is what instinctively prompts the spirit to constantly make reparation without our knowing why. It is said, "All nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Even though this evidently constitutes a universal message, it is no less true to say that the way it is couched makes distinctions between the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. The stars are at a high level of spirituality, while the sand is trodden underfoot. This duality of the human condition that pushes some of us to look at the firmament and others to search in the sand is expressed by the word ekev, because you have obeyed me. And akev is indeed the heel that stamps down on the sand. Because you have followed my commandment. But in the secret of the nistar, this means that you have had the souls of Sodom and Gomorrah to make reparation for their sins. This means that you have listened to my voice and followed my commandment that consisted in sacrificing your son to compensate for the souls of Sodom and Gomorrah and to redeem them, apidion. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Your only. We know, however, that Isaac was not the only child of Abraham, and that the latter also loved Ishmael, the child he had had with Hagar, Sarah's maidservant. God was with the boy as he grew up. But God decided to test Abraham. He ordered him to sacrifice his son Isaac, an only child, in exchange for the future resurrection of all the souls of Sodom and Gomorrah. and God insisted as if he were talking to a child. Take your son, your one and only, Isaac, whom you love. It is as if God were checking up that Abraham fully understood the importance of the sacrifice and was making sure that he would not renege on his promise. It is true, however, that Abraham loved both children with the same love. But the phrase, whom you love, expressed in Hebrew as ahavta, contains the root of the word father. If we make the V a B and alludes to paternity, abahut. For father is av or ab and can be understood etymologically as elokut bo, namely divinity is the name. For it was said at the beginning of recorded time, God created man in his own image. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. There is no difference in nature between the paternity of a father and that of God, but only a difference of degree. Human paternity transmits the intrinsic qualities of the father when he conceives the son with the context of a loving and perfectly harmonious relationship, hormonally and in accordance with loving feelings. This was the case with Isaac that he conceived with Sarah, the woman closest to his heart, whereas Ishmael was conceived with Sarah's maidservant at a lower level of feeling, as an antidote to the disappointment caused by an upsetting barrenness on Sarah's part. That experience was terrible. It reflects the attribute of justice that wise men gave to Isaac. The term fear of Isaac crops up several times in the text. It recalls his mother's laughter when his forthcoming birth was announced to her. The word laughter is said in Hebrew tzchok and is an onomatopoeia formed from the words tziduk achok, that is, rigor of justice. An excess of justice that raises the question of knowing if God has dispossessed himself of grace to the extent of asking from Abraham such a sacrifice. A man who prays to save another is exposed to divine justice, and causes in this way the sins of the latter to be pardoned for, founding himself on fraternity, and by means of the principle of communicating vessels, he shifts the judgment of one group onto another. He therefore needs himself to be a righteous man, so as not to be judged in the place of those for whom he asks for grace. It is the privilege of kings to render justice for justice and grace for grace. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. This is not a question. Does not God know how many righteous people there are in Sodom? It is therefore an answer. There are not 50 righteous people in the town of Sodom. Then Abraham spoke up again. Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I'm nothing but dust and ashes. Save these souls, for I am consubstantial with them. Have you not seen in me an improved and repaired version of humanity? Do not the people of Sodom and Gomorrah have descendants able to recognize in future your royalty in their next life? Will you not spare them for my sake, for the grace you have shown me? Answer imagined by the present author. What if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50. Will you destroy the whole city? If I find 45 there, he said, I will not destroy it. In fact, that is not just a silly and stupid process of barter that the patriarch is dragging into. For him, it is a question of defining the exact limits of divine grace and justice, for there are not even 45 men in the valley of the demons. Then he said, May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there? He answered, For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. The 10 fingers on our hands represent the divine order in man's creation. For as well as separating body from spirit, God has separated the 10 fingers of our hands to round off his creation, as it were. And this was the last body contact between the Creator and his creature. It is therefore normal that the negotiation for the survival of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah ends with this number. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. What takes our breath away is the secrecy surrounding what comes next after God had rejected the figure of 10 as the minimal figure to safeguard the fate of the 5 towns. This is left to our imagination, which must understand that Abraham has gone away satisfied too, and not just Lot, who begged God to save the town of Bela. The spiritual superiority of Abraham in comparison with his pupil, Lot, leads us to suppose that the negotiation dwindled to one just man, apart from Lot, who was not included in the cataclysm. As a last resort, Abraham has renounced one just person, his son, whose forthcoming birth had been announced to him by the angels, in exchange for the just person who would have saved the 5 towns in the valley of the Jordan, if there had only been one. Without this, it would have been inconceivable that Lot, the patriarch's pupil, would have been granted his wish to save the town of Bela, in which he was to take refuge for a time, while his master, Abraham, could be refused the reparation of the souls of Lot's shepherds, who had sheltered for the moment in the cursed towns. If I had to guess what the sequel was in the conversation between God and the prophet, it would have to say something like, perhaps just one just person lives there. Would you destroy a town in which there is one just person because of 1,000 imperious ones? And the Lord would answer, I would not destroy it, even if there were only one. Author's own commentary. Well then, Abraham then would say, with an air of anticipatory satisfaction common to those who know in advance what their interlocutor will give them, the answer they want. Take the son that you have given me, of whom you proclaim to me that he would be the start of offspring, as numerous as the stars in the firmament and the sand of beaches, and exchange him for the imperious beings of the towns of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zvoya, and Bela, and the shepherds of Lot, my nephew, so that they can come. Well then, Abraham then would say with an air of anticipatory satisfaction common to those who know in advance that their interlocutor will give them the answer they want. Take the son that you have given me, of whom you proclaim to me that he would be at the start of offspring as numerous as the stars in the firmament and the sand of beaches, and exchange him for the impious beings of the towns of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zvoya, and Bela, and the shepherds of Lot, my nephew, so that they can come back to earth and make reparation for their sins, and be reincarnated among my descendants in order to create a people of priests to officiate in your temple. Author's own commentary. At the end of this passage, we are told that Abraham returned home, unlike God, who does not have a home on earth, but King Solomon will later build one for him. The word home in this context, or to his place literally, comes out in Hebrew as limkomo, from the root makom, meaning place. We read apropos of the mountain of Moriah on which the sacrifice of Isaac took place. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place, Hamakom, in the distance. The Hebrew word is actually Hamakom, the place, which presupposes that this place was determined in advance during the negotiation regarding the survival of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and has a link with the place where Isaac was sacrificed. It is the sacrifice, that of Isaac, the son of Abraham the prophet, which earned mankind in general, and the Jews in particular, the ceremonial and supernatural presence of God on earth. The temple is referred to in Hebrew as Bet HaMikdash, from the root of the word lehakdish, which means to consecrate, recalling the Holocaust that Abraham consecrated and sacrificed in honor of God and for such a sublime cause. This demonstration is not rhetorical, but the expression of something that actually happened. The proof of this is found in the following passage. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, "Ve'yaveh bakad et Sarah." And the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him, Lemoed asher diber ito Elohim. At the start of this passage, the name of God is Jehovah, renowned as a byword for grace and goodness, while at the end of it, the word for God is the word that describes the God of justice, Elohim. That is so, we understand that God had fixed 2 dates for Abraham: a day of grace for the birth of his Isaac, and on this date he had been gracious towards him, and a second date with destiny, the day of sacrifice. For this day he had clothed himself in his judge's apparel. This was the day that God gave to Abraham human offspring, when the latter chose the souls of the impious of Sodom and Gomorrah to weave God's garment of justice. If this not enough to convince you that Isaac was the predestined victim of that negotiation, see the meaning of the term Lamoed, which means at the very time. God had promised him, from the word Yehud, meaning in Hebrew destiny, Yehud. So this is to be the child's destiny and also that of his descendants, since the Hebrews or Jews have always been called Yehudim, the predestined ones, with the Hebrew letter He standing in for Ain. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. Why the name Isaac? Yitzhak, which literally means he will love. Because he was born under the law, chok, of sacrifice. The irony of destiny, a very subtle balancing act between the two faces of divinity, justice and divine goodness. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh at me. This is funny, you have to admit. You give a woman back her youth so that she can give birth to a boy who will end up being sacrificed anyway. Sarah probably never knew about the fate in store for her only child. But her laughter, which takes God with a pinch of salt, rebounded on her, as if the order for the sacrifice had come from her own mouth. Often, the misfortunes that befall a person come from their own words, and without even knowing it, they condemn themselves. Words are a movement of air coming out of the mouth, which influence fate as much as justice does. The instrument of speech constitutes justice, while its content, when it speaks blessing or comforting and good words, attenuates that justice. The force of reparations which is contained in a good word is inestimable. And if we ask ourselves why Ishmael was only circumcised when he was 13 years old, while Isaac was 8 days after being born, I would say that there was no sentence of death hanging over the former, whereas in Isaac's case, the die was cast. His fate decided, and only a sacrifice of flesh like circumcision could have put in an appeal for him and changed his destiny. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share the inheritance with my son Isaac. We see that destiny can sometimes have surprises in store. For if Sarah laughed at the birth of Isaac, the son of her servant laughs at the macabre destiny of Isaac. If Sarah was ignorant of the death sentence weighing over Isaac, Ishmael himself was aware of it. He laughs because he could not see the usefulness of a feast to celebrate the birth of a child destined to be sacrificed anyway. Rashi, Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac Yerechi, interprets the word laughs as murders, for Ishmael was jealous of Isaac to the point where he would have put him in danger, and this is why, seeing how Ishmael was pointing his bow at him, Sarah got frightened. Who would have said to Abraham, Mi milel? Mi milel comes from melel, which means who has uttered these crazy words, and alludes to the crazy words that Abraham has uttered when he made the vow to sacrifice his son. This, in turn, is a skillful manipulation of mi pilel, the root of which pele means miracle. Who could have hoped for such a miracle, that Sarah would give Abraham a child, at such an advanced age. This is therefore a reference to the reproaches that she addressed to her husband for having uttered fatal and futile melel words to do with Isaac. I have borne him a son in his old age. In his old age comes out as liskunav, implying lischut kinyan, which means right of ownership. This is an implicit allusion to the fact that his son has allowed him to acquire a right of ownership over the souls of Sodom and Gomorrah. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Get rid of is expressed as garesh, which breaks down into ger and rash, and which means stranger in another country and poor without any wealth. This anticipates what the fate will be of the maidservant. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Sent her off, he drew up an act of divorce. He repudiated her. He took some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders. The shoulder in the human body is the symbol of solidarity. It is the symbol of the solidarity which should have been that of the two nations, issuing from Isaac and Ishmael, the symbol of what that solidarity will be between them at the end of time. Here is what Jacob, which is Israel, said on his deathbed. Then Israel said to Joseph, "I am about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And to you, as one who is over your brothers, I give the ridge of land I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow." In Shechem means in Hebrew shoulder, a universal symbol of solidarity. The solidarity of Joseph's brothers freed their sister Dinah from the hands of Shechem, the son of Hamor.